Our next talk is More Choices is Not Better, Advantages of Linear Storytelling. The speaker is Sisi Jiang, who is a game designer whose game Lion Killer was an IGF finalist for Excellent in Narrative this year.
Hi, thanks for coming, everybody. So welcome to Advantages in Linear Storytelling. Um, Sorry, I just realized these slides. Okay, there's a slide button. Okay, real quick, I want to acknowledge that we as an industry should be doing a lot better to sustainably support Black writers and narrative designers in our field. So like, hopefully this will be an ongoing commitment from us as a community. So about me, I'm Sisi. You know me probably because Lion Killer was nominated for an IGF Award in Excellence. And I was recently one of the writers on Signs of the Sojourner, which is a narrative card game about building conversations with card combinations. And I'm also currently working on the Theseus, I don't really know. And it's basically one of those teenage breakup songs from the 2000s. It's modernish, loosely based on the Minotaur myth. And I just realized that none of these game titles have any words that normal people would use in an everyday sentence. So that's my brand. Welcome to hell. Oh yeah. Oh, and my background, of course, is studying dead people, and it reflects pretty reflects pretty clearly in my work. So about this talk is some of these ideas will be very, very experimental. It's going to buck a lot of assumptions that I've read from narrative design books about what good narrative is. I'll be generalizing a lot because this is like I'll be going through a lot of topics and this is only an hour block. And this talk assumes that the narrative project you're working on has finite time and budget. And I don't know if this is different in AAA. So like, I'm really happy to hear any perspectives from that place. Okay, so here's the list of topics that we'll be diving through, which is the problem, the branching, linear, alternatives, rethinking narrative, and the conclusion. Okay, first of all, the problem. So broadly, this section is about how there's a lot of narrative work is really labor intensive, and oftentimes there's not enough player experience payoff to justify implementing them. So first of all, we're going to start with a little more my theorizing is that I actually don't think that player choice truly exists, and I'll be like walking through why. I think it's impossible to simulate the full range of choices in a narrative game. And I think that as like culturally, writers are pressured to create like really like labor intensive designs with very little player experience payoff. So I think in the context of all these problems, I don't think that player choice is necessarily universally desirable for every single project you work on. And okay, and so like first off, we know that every available action is in a game is pre-designed by the developers. There are happy physics accidents, but narratively meaningful choices require advanced planning. Consider the example of dog petting. Most of us can agree that petting a dog is good and necessary. It also requires a lot of intentional design and coordination. You cannot pet the dog if there are no dogs. You cannot pet the dog if your game does not give you hands. You cannot pet the dog if nobody programmed the command to pet the dog. You cannot pet the dog if an animator has not implemented the petting animation. Who said that I wanted to pet a dog? What if I wanted to high five the dog? What if I wanted to high five pet a dinosaur? Petting a dog is an expression of design, not expression of player choice. Adding narrative to a story does not overcome the fundamental lack of mechanical freedom that is present in every video game. So unless you design all of your own controllers, all of the player's means of interacting with the video game have been predetermined by the inventor of the QWERTY keyboard, Xbox, Nintendo, and PlayStation. In real life, your body is limited by your actions are limited by your body. In video games, you don't have all your joints. You only have a few directional sticks, 4 trigger buttons, 4 action buttons. And if you want to like learn more about alternative controls, you should check out these two researchers, Stephanie and Patrick from UC Davis, who like first made me aware of thinking about game design in terms of alternative controls. So this is a bad art history joke about how this art is not really a pipe, it is a picture of the pipe, and it's this art is meant to make us think about how signs are not the things that they represent. Like for example, we associate circle with dodge and like square with attack, and triangle is action. And so controller inputs are the signs, and the game actions are the concept that they represent. You're not actually dodging. You're using O as a predetermined shorthand to express the concept of dodging. So in this sense, I think that actions, in terms of actions, players are communicating with the game. They're not making actions in the game. And honestly, this is about to get really, this was really so this is like me trying to get really theoretical about it, and I'd like to bring it to some more like practical examples. So yeah, that's kind of my stance on this. So in the second section, we're going to talk about branching. And I think I am pretty qualified to talk about branching because like I've received a nomination in IGF for a game that had 242 passages and 385 links. So I know that there's a lot of production load when it comes to branching, like we are the scope creep. And I know a lot of writers like to power through overwhelming production demands, but I think that our brains are going to be less creative if we're like mentally juggling multiple micro branches. Even when you're working on one branch at a time, if you're tracking, even if you're tracking variations in a spreadsheet, the need to synchronize all those branches take up a lot of mental load. Like whether or not you're really like actively thinking about other branches. I'm not saying that all branch that games should never branch, but I think it does mean that we have to acknowledge that every significantly branching narrative story should have more than one writer. So let's talk about Lion Killer. There were a lot of mistakes. This infamous opium den scene had a lot of mistakes. So I crunched pretty significantly on the third part, and part of this is because the final push is always going to be a little bit like work heavy. But but I think crunch was due to a lot of design decisions that I did not really think through, and I just did because they were cool. And there were like I think there were like four different outcomes for the opium den, depending on the player's allegiance, the availability of a gun, fraternity points, and quest choices. And this section was also one of the more bug-prone sections because like I'm one person, I can't test everything, and it's just really hard to test everything. And it caused a lot of player grief. And personally, this is one of those things where I would have cut the idea significantly if I had to like remake this game, and I do not think it was worth it. And I think it's good to like talk about like some ideas just weren't worth it. Um, so as I mentioned before, branching narrative is the scope. When the project is scrambling to make up for other delays, the more isolated branches are prime candidates for the cutting, and these isolated branches are often like the most creative or like choiciest parts of the narrative. And I think, and obviously it's easier to cut narrative than like herd a dozen people into making your branch. And like I made Lion Killer by myself, which is significantly easier than trying to get like a whole bunch of people to make my idea. And I still cut a lot of branches just to avoid having to build them. And so I say isolate, I mean like again, branches that are more subverted from the main content. And because I knew this was going to be a huge production risk while I was developing Lion Killer, I never branched content more than two passages away from the critical path. The critical path being like the main kind of the main content that like undergirds your game. And I think that like narrative design is really difficult to measure. And I think designing branch content takes like longer than writing. And it's not really like, I don't think it's really possible to measure the amount of work it takes to branch like using word count. Like word count doesn't actually explain like some of the like having to like juggle like some of the mechanical demands of the game. Like one time I spent a Saturday morning making a small twine game called, I think it was called Falling is Not the Same Thing as Dying. Designing took 6 hours. The writing took two. So this time obviously varies, but like consistently, I find myself spending way more on design, more time on design than I ever spend on writing. So I think that branching can has a possibility of discouraging creative risk because I would much rather put my best writing and my best ideas on the critical path that all players will actually experience. Hence why like some of Lion Killer's most notable scenes about warfare are not branched. I force you to go through all of them. And more ambiguous content or more like expressive content, I'll leave it to like some side branches that not everyone is going to go through because I think like emotionally, it's very demoralizing for writers to put a lot of creative energy into a risky branch that will ultimately end up on the chopping block. Um, and branching can and like one of the things is that branching can be more controlled if like they're expressive rather than state changing like but I implemented a whole personality system in the first part of Lion Killer that counted traits such as brazen, perceptive, and reliable. These variables would affect small character reactions. Sometimes the intelligence stat would provide puzzle hints. Nobody ever commented on this system to me, which is an indication that it was probably not implemented well, which is my other lesson is that branching doesn't work if you try to conceal them. And sometimes in the case of like telltale games, like even like having the realizing the player record that the computer recorded your choice is kind of a meta game in itself. So branching also invites a lot of ambiguity because it encourages writers to be more like loose about details because you have to make sure that all the choices eventually converge at some point. And this makes players feel bad if they've been led to believe that their choices were dynamic and state altering. So it's just like one of the big aspects of emotional design is that you should not overpromise. Because like I like making a boring game is one thing, but like breaking people's expectations, I think, is a lot worse. And like one of the reasons why Lion Killer Part 3 contained less branching is because I wanted to wrap up some foreshadowed plot elements, like actually having to fight the British and the opium trade, which had a lot of various hints dropped in earlier parts. And again, even if your narrative isn't reactive, keeping track of disparate branches means that you have less brain space to dive deeper into the path that you already have. You're spending time branching instead of actually focusing on telling the story. And if we didn't aim for 1,000 branches from the outset, then we could have dedicated all that focus into making great content instead of making stuff that just gets thrown away. Like it's like we should start thinking about like what opportunity did we lose when we decide to cut an entire branch because that takes a lot of work and it also just sucks like in terms of morale to have a write a bunch of great content that gets trashed for like totally unavoidable, well not unavoidable but for like production reasons that you can't really fight. So yeah, writers, we need to have an honest discussion about how branching content tends to be tend to be lower quality than when you like a single writer has to write both branches. At least that's true my personal experience. And I think that having more writers would ensure that writers would be able to dedicate more attention to powerful narrative expression and player experience. But this of course this would also require us to like evaluate like do we even have enough writers on the team. And I think there's not enough conversation, like in at least not in the circles I run with. Like we need to have more conversation about what branching means in terms of workload, and because like the costs of branching occur whether we pretend it exists, whether we pretend we can do it all or not. So if I had a writing team, I would probably approach it like branching stories are largely a series of linear stories joined together, but with slight variations or like bigger variations. So I'd probably have like writers write every separate like major branches separately, and I would have of course keep documentation so that people don't have weirdly like deviating stories, and we should have an editor check for consistency in the places where they join up. I think just like keeping things like keeping things separated and like having people specialize is just going to like make stories a lot better. Never half-ass when you can whole-ass. Uneven story quality can lead some players to thinking that the story is just bad. Like if they didn't get to your good branch, they got to your bad branch. And one caveat is that players will notice bad content. They will be less likely to notice content that just does not exist. If you only have enough bandwidth to make one branch shine really brightly, then you should just make that one branch instead of half-assing both. Make one great branch, like just like. But of course, this requires a lot of foresight and like realizing that you can't make like five branches at once. So like I've half-assed a lot of lion killer content, and honestly I should have just not made a lot of this like really half-assed content. So this is another part about branching content that is often referenced in a lot of like narrative design books is that imagine you want to make some branching content. The morally good branch costs $5,000 to make. The morally bad branch costs $5,000 to make. 90% of your players pick the good branch. How do you justify to whoever is bankrolling you to like that a morally bad branch is even worth making? Because most human beings, or there's some data on this, but like that I didn't work into the slides, but most people inherently want to pick the good choices. People only pick the evil choices if it's sufficiently compelling, or if they're partially repulsed by the good choice. That's why we design around gray morality, which is when you either kill your best friend or you cause mass death. And this describes a lot of video games, so I swear I'm not like just ragging on like some game I have a personal vendetta against, because this is a lot of games made in the past 10, 20 years. um and the other thing about gray morality that I feel like needs to be addressed is that it presents its own design constraints. The gray morality prevent you from being able to author truly uplifting narratives about courage and integrity. All design philosophies have limitations, and we need to acknowledge the creative shackles of presenting all choices as equally bad. And of course, like in the example of Lion Killer, I don't think I've ever made players make any choices that were like horrible, like the outright horrible. I don't think the player ever gets to like actually hurt anybody, because gray morality often make players distrustful of narrative designers. Beauty and goodness do not always have to be survived, but you test a player's patience every time that you destroy them. Do I care about a fictional world that always bleeds despite all my efforts to save it? Especially if I've made a lot of personal sacrifices to do the right thing. Pretty unlikely. And so, if we want players to care about our worlds, we need to make like the worlds worth caring about. And like we have to make it so that people that the morality of like our choice design makes people actually want to live in this world, because they're going to be spending a lot of time in it, hopefully. So when you do destroy, I think it's important to think about doing it for a specific narrative purpose and not as like a default plot device to lean on. Because just because the real world does not always reward our efforts to save it doesn't mean that we should always try to replicate that in a video game. And I think in like its art is really powerful because it's capable of showing people that better possibilities exist. Yeah, this is where I'm going with this talk, is that it's hard to advocate expression as a design philosophy because in America, like acting is presented as inherently masculine and feeling is feminine. And so, like, whenever I hear the words walking simulator or visual novel slung around, there's some connotations that are like, this is not a masculine way to make a video game. And I think that's weird and bad because we should accept all designs that have something interesting. We're doing something interesting, doing something well, instead of thinking that if something isn't a genre, then it's bad. Um, and so like wait, I forgot to okay, you know what? I'll just skip that part. So why does our profession emphasize choice when it doesn't even benefit the game? And this is going to be spicy as always. But I think that game writers want to emphasize that we can do things that TV and film writers can't do. I don't think this position benefits our craft. We should always be learning from other like art disciplines, and I think we have like in our DNA the tech obsession, because this video games are tech, of like of disrupting linear narrative. And I think that linear proc gen and other forms of storytelling all occupy like wildly different niches. And I feel like there's also like some kind of like, and I'm not like really sure about like there's some kind of problem that we have about like that I've seen from people like I guess like me knowing who wrote my favorite parts of a game, because I know all of my like favorite writers in like Japanese games, but like when I try to like conjure up like who wrote what part of like like it's not something that we really like talk about, and then like English gaming communities really talk about who wrote this part of the game. I don't know. This could just be me. And I think that American mythology has a tendency of historicizing itself in terms of replacement. And this extends to how we talk about technology, like the PS3 replaces the PS2, is how we talk about the PS2. We talk about full immersion replaces structured UI, like that time, like the 2010s, where we were like, let's get rid of UI because it looks gamey and non immersive. And procedural generation replaces like, oh, like more like structured narratives. And I am borrowing Xavier's words for a moment about how quickly we abandon ideas and how we're abandoning ideas that are good. And we should not just like abandon ideas or like and like I'm thinking like we shouldn't even abandon linear narrative because or like try to abandon it because like it's still good. Like there's still good ways of telling stories that we haven't fully explored in linear narrative. So don't throw away good ideas. Oh, old ideas and good ideas. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about like linear storytelling finally after like two sections. So games are boxes that players willingly place themselves in order to derive meaning from order. Why respect the rules of chess or checkers? Because rules allow us to derive strategy and gain human insight. Rules insert predictability into our interactions with other players. We have to think about predictability as valuable, as something that can give us something interesting. So if we apply this to video games, we insert predictability into our interaction with game environments. All games are fundamentally rule boxes, even if they have nonlinear structures or design is inherently tyrannical. And in order to be effective and benevolent tyrants, we have to acknowledge our power instead of hiding behind like, oh, you get to make all your own choices when that's often not, I mean, that's almost never true. I mean, never true. And I think that linear games can be a powerful expression of a responsibility to players. So, my definition of linear games, and of course, there are different degrees of linearity, is that linear games usually have one single critical path. There can be side quests, but they usually have minimal effect on the big picture or like purely cosmetic ones. And like in linear role playing games, are usually completion based goals, such as see all the cutscenes, give presents to all the party members, and the full completion of these goals is to be assumed canon. Actually, you know what? I should just show you the examples. Okay. Yeah, I play a lot of Japanese games, and in Yakuza Zero, even if you've never met some of the gang leaders in previous games, the main character will always interact with these characters as if they have completed the full all of the side quests. And in Fate Grand Order, there are like there's an established like true timeline, but even if the game operates under the assumption of multiple timelines and like the multiverse. Um, and so and Zero Escape, there's like literally like, I don't know 50 endings, but like the player like usually dies or meets a horrible fate in like mo- all of them except for one. So like not like and like in Zero Escape, and I think this is a trait of JRPGs, is that if you die, that's not considered valid. Like that route is just not canon. But in like American, like I mean, I guess not American, but like Western games, like in like I was playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I killed off Cassandra's entire family because like I was like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. She doesn't trust anybody. Man, screw Greece. So like in that instance, the game treated me killing off her entire family as canon, and like that's my canon, and like that just is not going to happen in like like pretty much like every Japanese game I've ever played. Yeah, and I also felt like bringing up that Fate Grand Order is like ridiculously popular, even among other gachapon games and like other some games that have like that have story in them. And it's like I think last year was like the most talked about game on Twitter, even above Fortnite or like Final Fantasy or like Super Smash Bros. So it's like I mean, if people are talking about a game, I assume that it's because this story is interesting. But like so that's kind of my spiel. Um, so what about freedom? And I personally don't think freedom really means anything in game design. And I actually and like and we really think about it, like when a game gives you 7 different action choices, you probably only really care about 2 or 3 choices at maximum. You care about the best choices, whether or not it's 3 best choices or 2. What if the game gave you like 20 choices? Do you feel more empowered or do you feel tired? I just I just don't like I personally from my experience developing Lion Killer, I just don't think people really cared about having like a billion choices because I tried that route. I tried having like here's your 5 different like character specific personality options. And I don't know, I just don't like all of the feedback I got. Like people didn't even notice. People didn't notice, and people didn't demand that I add more choices. Like I've never heard anyone say, "Oh, this wasn't choicey enough," and like this is not a game that like necessarily does like a whole bunch of choices, especially in the other routes. Like my players did not care they about choice. They cared about scenes where I gave them new perspectives on historical topics, or like if they were like personally invested in like the romance subplot. Um, so okay, like most game experiences are linear just because like if you pick one choice, you're not gonna really spend a lot of time thinking about like the other choice and think, oh, it's non-linear. Like people are just gonna think of their personal playthrough as that one linear story. So like even if you have like a whole bunch of choices, like people are not really actively thinking. So I think it's important to acknowledge that players don't play narrative games like we do. Um, Most people just don't have multiple playthroughs. I mean, I've talked to people who design mobile games, and they're like, "Oh yeah, nobody ever like goes for multiple playthroughs. Like we're all busy people here." So that's just so like most people don't even like just like most people. I don't even have time to play my entire backlog. So like that's kind of my stance on like whether or not people are making like 10 different playthroughs. So we've just been talking about the narrative and we haven't really been talking about the play. And I think that interaction and gameplay is not just press F to pay respects. If anything, that's a meme because it's such a weirdly implemented choice. Like, what do you mean, like press paying respects at a button? Like, I'm usually paying respects without pressing a button when my beloved character dies on the screen. I have to put down my controller and like stare at the ceiling a little bit. And I was actually really inspired by this one tweet that I can't find by Dia, who was talking about how films are also interactive. People are not just passively consuming during the cutscenes. And one really good example is Ace Attorney. But honestly, this is really applicable to like pretty much every single detective game is that there's only one outcome, but people love the crime solving element and like there's a meta game going on beyond like just putting clues together or like marking off suspects. Like you're just, like mentally you're thinking about what happened, who done it, and like there's a meta game going on inside your head even when you're not actively like game playing the gamey parts of a detective game. And like can we really think about it, like play is not the I don't think play is necessarily just like the action of like mashing buttons. It's like if anything, I think you can play even within cutscenes. I mean, because like you're mentally like you're playing with like the scenario. So this is another spicy slide is that I do not think cutscenes are inherently bad. I read the game narrative toolbox and the big tip that I took away from it is that you need to like minimize cutscenes and let people interact with the game as much as possible. And I disagree with it because I find it a little bit prescriptive. And I think that taking control away from the player doesn't have to be a taboo concept. A well implemented cutscene can have just as much emotional impact is a then or much more impact than a poorly implemented player choice. Instead of assuming that players will intuitively hate cutscenes, I think game writers should like look at things like JRPGs, like or like fans of JRPGs, how they feel about cutscenes, because like the way that they consume cutscenes is pretty different. And like I mean, there's arguments in like some communities about whether or not certain routes are canon enough because they didn't have enough cutscenes. And I think there are bad cutscenes out there, but like and like I obviously if you do anything bad, people will hate it. But like I don't think that cutscenes are inherently problematic. So how are games different from movies? I think this is not a very useful way to think about video games because, again, we should be influenced by every form of popular media. But I think that linear narrative has drastically different. pacing in video games than they do in movies. Even if a game is linear, you still have to catch up the player. You can't just drop them into a completely unfamiliar situation. So like even then, like I think that in game experience is like not necessarily like the same every time. And I think the more creative your narrative is, the more you have to help the player integrate into the game. Like of course this is true for anyone who's ever written a tutorial, which I did, but you can't just abandon the player to go chasing the plot. It just does usually does not happen that way. So simulating, like, were we going for the simulation? I think just by playing as someone with a huge sword or someone who owns a house, the player is essentially role playing as a different persona from who they are in real life. If we were actually simulating players, then I would be playing as a sad, powerless nerd in quarantine. That's not as fun as the alternative of owning a flamethrower and beating up nasty jerks. Oh, great. That was on accident. Um, there we go. And I think like for me, my experience of playing games my entire life is that games fail to be power fantasies. I usually do not get to play as non-binary characters, and Pokemon Red has been taunting me about this ever since I had a Game Boy Color. And most Western video games are not going to let me be any kind of Asian. I can have horns, but I cannot have monolid eyelids. And so it kind of sucks to be presented options only for the game to not deliver. So like, but I still enjoy these games. That's the thing. These games are still among like my favorite games. And I mean Dragon Age Origins was better. But like some of these like are my favorite games. So it proves that we don't have to have like one-to-one players like syncing up with their avatar character for a game to be good and fun. So one of my friends actually made this poll a little while back, and she's a narrative designer and as a narrative designer, Hardsu, and she made this poll. And it turns out only 26% of 176 people who follow her or have answered this poll were dead set about role playing as themselves. So, like to me, it was really exciting to see real data on how there's a huge space for people to like just play really good characters, even if it's not necessarily who they are in real life. Role playing, yeah. I'm gonna here talk about like what how do we make these characters good? Is that having a set number of protagonists is great. It's fine. And it works as long as you create a character that people actually want to spend dozens of hours with. And you and like because like I've given up on linear games where like I hated the main character and I was like I hate you, you're rude, you're awful, I don't like you. um and like I don't want to spend time with this jerk. So I think it's important first of all, of course, to always still have a likable protagonist, but also like you have to define a relationship with this character. Like is this a character someone that people want to be bros with? Is this someone's child that they want to protect at all costs? Is this someone who is like a lofty aspiration for us to emulate in our everyday lives? And I think these relationships can replace the feeling of having to be like represented by the avatar if you're not making like an avatar kind of game. So I actually think that Japanese games have actually made fantastic linear games. And I think a lot of this has to do with the audience, is that the audience like I think that like Japanese audiences kind of expect that if there is a story, that story is going to be like at least it's like it like they're looking for story, like they're looking for a good story, and they don't like Japanese games are not like most of them that I've played are not trying to hide the narrative. They're not trying to disguise it with gameplay, and for some reason, there's like so many like American games I've played that like try to like hide the fact that there is a story, and it's just really weird. I don't know. And I think that since JRPGs and VNs are globally popular, that's good because it's a built-in audience. We don't have to like, is that we can see that it's possible to teach players to want linear content. And but also like emphasizing the importance of building up the expectation that linear narrative can be good, because right now we're operating the assumption that linear narrative is not something that players want. And we should not be presenting linear narrative as mushy peas that we wish to hide in our child's dinner, because you treat something like mushy peas, then your audience is also going to treat something like mushy peas. I mean, they're going to realize that like this like story is probably not good if you're trying to hide it. Um, I also think that like VNs and JRPGs are not as like I guess like discussed in like except for in a few queer circles, I don't think there's necessarily like mainstream discussed in a lot of a lot of dev spaces I've been because they're Japanese, and I think it's just made me think a while about how like interactive fiction is a word that we use to describe games that are Western and therefore good, modern, and like VNs are like Asian and like queer and feminine and all these other words that we don't associate with like necessarily like like real gameplay or whatever. And this is my perspective as someone who is like like some like someone all of like those things. Um and I think in order to be like better students of narrative, we have to unlearn our Orientalist biases against like certain forms of games and like go play games like Zero Escape, Ace Attorney, World Ends with You. Okay, more dev story time. I remember a specific instance of violating player autonomy is that I gave the player the option to enlist in the Opium War for their own reasons. I also gave them a huge diverging branch where they ran away with their lover. The reality is that I was not given a limited budget to make two entirely different games, so I forced the player to join the war on gunpoint. Um, so that felt really bad. I did a lot of foreshadowing about the war in the intro, but it still felt bad. What if we were just honest about this? What if we told the players up front that they were not authoring the story? What if I told them straight up that their elopement was not going to end well? And I mean, players would probably feel less betrayed once I had to cut the choices for production reasons because it will happen. Like 40% of the central conflict of Lion Killer was cut for production reasons. But I did tell the players up front they were merely fulfilling a destiny rather than authoring it because, like, betraying the player's good faith comes with an emotional cost. It makes the players less likely to actually engage with the narrative content when you set up narrative content in the future. And I think that like giving away future events can increase player interest and anticipation. Like in Fire Emblem Awakening and Yakuza 3, they straight up tell you which main characters are going to get mortally wounded or die. They cut straight, and then after telling you who dies, they cut straight to the backstory. And that inspired me to spoil the death of a major character. Don't worry, these slides will be up somewhere later. So don't worry about reading it. Don't read it. So I spoiled the death of my main character in one of my personal projects because I was like, hey, if I make their death really interesting, don't you want to know more? Don't you want to know like the context and the emotional stakes? So like it's a risk, but like I think that we like, like there's more opportunities for storytelling if we like stop being so hung up about like, oh, we have to surprise people constantly because surprise like you're really screwed if the surprise doesn't actually wow anyone or like if it gets spoiled or whatever. I think linear games are incredibly edgy. Like, I think it's really cool to say from the get go, you have one or two choices maximum. You can take it or not buy the game because it shows confidence to me that the writer has really high storytelling ability, and that's kind of scary. Like, I totally get it. Like, for like because you have to put all your eggs in one basket when you author something that like way more narrative. And I think that's actually why more people should be making linear games is because creativity blossoms under constraints. That's why a lot of us become game developers is that like constraints fosters creativity. And I think we should think about how claiming to fulfill fantasies and like giving players the wheel can be a way of disclaiming responsibility for how the story ends or how the story plays out. Like not always, I'm not saying that we all consciously do this, but I think it's a dynamic that we can really think about when we make video games. Part four, rethinking narrative. And because like it's not enough to just change the narrative structure of what your like branches and your like lines look and your like links look like. I think it's important to think about how you're telling the story. So here's some of the things I've been thinking about. I think that strong linear games require designers to assert their vision rather than leaning on ambiguity. Narrative design has the ability to simulate emotional space and limitations. It has the ability to manipulate players' sense of time, and it has the ability to fulfill emotional needs. So I got an IGF nomination for being detailed in a history game. Like, do you know how mind blowing that is? I mean, like we literally like there's like if you've read Harry Potter, like it's an entire in joke that history is like the most boring, awful subject on earth. And people actually wanted to know like what's going on in my game. Like So it's proof that like detail can work. Being incredibly detailed in research can work. And specificity can be really powerful if you're a good storyteller. A fan recently quoted, "Lesbians love the kind of misery that shatters their little stillborn hearts." And I think it's kind of flattering that they even still remember this after like a year after playing the game. I mean, like that's such a specific line to like hang on. Like it's like my quote is living rent free in their heads. Like that's so specific. And so like I just think we need to think about how like audiences want details when there's nuance and emotional texture. And if people don't want to know more details about your story, then you're probably doing a lore dump or like you're not like telling it super well because like if players are indifferent to a lore dump, then it's not necessarily a testament to the superiority of vagueness. Like maybe they just don't want to know more. And so a good writer, I think, can be able to tell the difference between like a detailed story and a lore dump. This is one of my favorite Tumblr posts of all time. Is that like people want are so hungry and starved for details if your writing is like really good and they care about these characters like bread characters. So one of the most influential people on my games is Bahia Khan, and this is actually like before like she won the IGF, but like I've been playing her twine since I first started really making twines. And so like and I like one of the games that I really liked, well, she made this a little later, but like I still really like this one is Blood Under the Bridge isn't shy about inserting poetry in the middle of the action. There's a the games may like create a medical physical space between the actual action, the player character's thoughts, and the present developer's thoughts. Because there's two Bahias in this game. Um there's like Bahia who's like kind of like introspecting over like, oh, what happened was like this. But also like there's the character in the actual game who is a little bit more who's a lot younger and has different perspectives about what's going on with her friends and boys and such. And of course like you're also like there's some action like there's some like things going on and you're also in this space with like the two of her. Sorry. So, and I think game really showed me how, like, through games, we can create little mini pockets of emotional space or compress them all in a linear format. There'll be multiple pockets in like one linear story. So, stories can be very dense. And I'm also going to talk about War and Pieces, which honestly, like Lion Killer would not exist if War and Pieces did not exist. And I was really inspired by the fluid and like really rigid way approach to like building space within a game. Is that the game doesn't have to be anything. It's exactly what the designer wanted. And this game breaks like conventional game design rules while rigidly enforcing its own. And honestly, this is a lot of like games by like people of color, indigenous game developers that like I really like respect. Um, because like what really helped me is that like War and Peace has freed me from the trap of having to build every single scene that happened. Instead of having to explain everything about how things were, I could jump over things that were too clunky for the flow, and I could really like invent new space instead of like stiffly following chronology. And this is kind of why like Blind Killer as a history game plays the way that it does. And like also like boundaries. I forgot to address this. Boundaries are important because linear games aren't just about getting the player's buy-in. It's also about asserting that there are good reasons for not giving the player unlimited choices and unlimited freedom. Great, I should have showed this earlier, but yeah, the slides will be up later. So if you look at yes, I opened this up in Twine. So if you look at these passages, the game starts off with a lot of branches, and like all of them bottleneck that specific question. And um, and like there's some dead ends. Like if you answer the question incorrectly, then you fall into a bunch of dead ends. You can't proceed with the story. While the meat of the story requires you to answer the question correctly. And great, I didn't put it there, but the question is, are the oppressed in a community with their oppressors? And War and Pieces treats the player's preconceptions of nationhoods as an obstacle for clearing the game. I struggled to advance past this portion a lot until I hit the exact responses of the game deemed empathetic enough to proceed. Only then would I be able to read like the rest of the story about this Palestinian family. And usually, bottlenecks in game design are bad. The player might get frustrated before they clear it. In this instance, I was motivated to move forward because I could tell that there was narrative intention in what the game was trying to get me to answer. And I think this kind of narrative design philosophy is what we need in both indie and AAA. Is a video game's willingness to draw a line in the sand for narrative purposes rather than telling the player the customer is a king. And it kind of requires designers to insist on their own vision and philosophy over whatever, over like just giving the players whatever they think they want. And this was actually a whole slide, but I forgot that it was there. Um, so I think it's impossible to design anything like truly great if you like are like constantly obsessed with what the player might like think about it. So yeah, that was my takeaway. So time. You know what we do have over movies? Time. Lots and lots of it. Most commercial games run anywhere from a couple of hours to hundreds of hours to years. Animal Crossing and mobile games or games that require a lot of time over a long period, like multiplayer, like RPG games. And I think it's important to think about when we think about narrative is how we're feeding content to players over an IV drip, even like narrative ones. And I think even when like without branching or jumping runs of time progressing. So, you've never played it before. The Lion Killer like allows you to click on like macros in order to proceed. And and the reason I did this is because I get overloaded with information very easily. Players like personally, I want to only move on when my brain is finished processing everything. So readers only move on when they're ready. And this is important to me because I pause games a lot, even like action games. Like my brother would laugh at me because I paused Mass Effect because I don't know, I get freaked out. I pause Mass Effect a lot, and it's because I get overwhelmed sometimes. And I think it's really cool. And I think that's something that I want to kind of like buck when I make design my own games. I think it's really cool that Lion Killer players have experienced a game at wildly different paces. Like no two people's experiences are the same. Because I had a friend who finished the game in 30 minutes. Another person finished it in 2 hours. And those people had like a wild, so those people had a wildly different way of actually experience the game. And this is why I think it was really important, even though this design took freaking forever and I cried so much. I still think it was really one of those labor intensive features that were actually worth it. Um, great. I had a slide for this. Sorry. If we can get the video play, here's my current project. Yeah, breakup simulator. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, this is a 3D narrative game that takes place in a labyrinth. And I knew that I wanted to make a game that physically embodied narrative structure. By making the game about a labyrinth and physically the level is a labyrinth, I was able to convey the narrative limitations of the game to players ahead of time. A labyrinth is thematically about barriers and confusion and dead ends, and there are limited ways to solve one. Because that's kind of why I customized Maze myself, is because I could measure the space between narrative content and the number of walls between each intersection. Space became a way to deliver narrative pacing. Players would be given the next bit of dialogue as they move throughout the maze. And intersections wouldn't be the only place where narrative decisions of like binary decisions took place, is that the narrative length of the labyrinth could also be a mental space for the protagonist to reflect on where everything went wrong. The player starts in media res of the action, and the labyrinth is a space for like the player to think about the past and the future. And I think if we really like think about like the world that we live in, it's like we could work hard towards our goals, you could try your best, you might not always attain the same level of happiness or misfortune as someone who's born 10 miles luckier than you, 2 years luckier than you. Games have the ability to collapse both space, distance and time. games are also capable of like stretching these things out, and like you like are free from like the limit from like the natural limitations of these things. Uh, is this working? Okay. So here's the other thing about like linear games is that you can use emotional appeal, and it's a buffet out there. Like I get so excited thinking about the emotional potential of narrative games because players don't necessarily want freedom. They want narrative to address their emotional needs. They want to be acknowledged. All save files are a fossil record of the hours that we spent in the dark, controller in hand. This is true whether the player is engaging with a dating simulator or a first-person shooter. When you put a video game gun in the hands of a player, they don't dream of a freedom associated with peace. They dream of a world that tells them that they're a necessary and important existence. And why am I talking about this? Because I'm talking about this because players will give up freedom as long as it leads to adequate compensation. It's like the social contract. Like if you make people give up freedom, then you have to reward them somehow. Like, and you can do that emotionally. So I think it's important to like not get so caught up in like freedom and start and when you're writing a cutscene and just focus on whether or not your story is addressing some deep yearning within your players. They'll sit down as long as you've taught them to be patient and rewarded their patience. And we live in an era where people have no shortage of emotional want. Seriously, it's a buffet out there. You should get out there and write some beautiful, glorious video games. So, great. I should have actually made a conclusion slide, but there's no conclusion slide because this was last minute. Anyway, so players are not a static, unchanging mass. Their expectations about video games have been established by precedent, like like video games being primarily marketed towards teenage boys, but precedent does not set the fate of a medium in stone. New games are constantly changing our expectations for what narrative can be. My own Line Killer was the first Twan game to receive an IGF nomination. Unusual designs are capable of shaping what's possible in game narrative, but you have to be willing to stick to your guns when the status quo does not legitimize your game. And this is relevant to all artistic disciplines, but I think it's important to cater to audiences that already care about precise storytelling instead of like worrying too much about like, oh, or people gonna think it's filler. And I think it's like, I mean, I think it's kind of like trying to find an audience is kind of like getting a date. Like if they're not interested, you bail and find someone else who is. Like you shouldn't sacrifice genuinely good storytelling to satisfy people who just don't care about narrative. And like we think about these audiences like this is my personal life example, but sometimes I talk to marginalized people from different like non-narrative disciplines like programming, art, uh UX design, or like honestly like that's really like probably the most examples I have. But like, when I talk to marginalized people from like other disciplines, their eyes kind of light up. Like when I tell them I'm a game writer, they're like, "Oh, that's so exciting!" And I feel bad because like I don't get that excited when people tell me they're an engine programmer. But like, but like, people. I think that people who struggle to find their place in the world would understand that narrative is not a luxury add-on. They know that narrative is necessary just to their survival as human beings, and people who think that stories are luxurious a la carte add-ons are probably okay with the stories that are playing out in their lives right now. And that's kind of why I think that being narratively kind to marginalized people isn't just a matter of decency or like social norms. It's about how we keep our narrative profession relevant, is that we have to reach out to the people that actually like need what we're trying to offer. So thank you for sticking it out this entire hour, or if you didn't stick out an entire hour, that's cool too. Just glad that you're here, or watching the recording. So I think we are good to start on Q&A. And wow, we did really great on time, which is my biggest worry throughout this discussion. So yeah, take it from here.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a question on my own account
Okay, sure.
because I'm old. And when I got into interactive fiction was a brand name, and these were puzzle games like Zork. And there was no concept of choice. Like you solve the puzzles, you don't think of that as a choice. You think of it as a puzzle. And when you solve all the puzzles, you win, and that's the end. Branching came later, and games without like narrative games without puzzles came later. So that seemed like movement. Do you think of this? Do you think there is a forward movement through this evolution, or is it outward? How do you think about that?
I think it's only evolution if you think that puzzle games are dead. Like, I mean, there's still obviously a lot of puzzle games out there, and I know this talk is not going to jive with every single person. I've like made peace with that. And like again, like I haven't made making games that long, so that's just my like zeitgeist moment of like understanding how like I guess narrative games. Um, Sorry, I was so busy defending myself that I've kind of forgotten. Evolution. Yeah, I don't think that things evolve as long. I mean, I don't think it's like a takeover. Like, I guess in terms of like evolution, if like things still exist. I don't know. This question is confusing to me. Sorry. Could you clarify?
Um, I'm not going to take over the questioning. I'm going to pass along another question. What is the single biggest takeaway that you learned after releasing Lion Killer and getting feedback?
Honestly, the feedback has been worryingly positive. Like, I think Andrew is like the only person ever given me something that was like not 100% enthusiastic. And honestly, I appreciate it because honestly, it worried me for a long time. I was like, where's the criticism? I mean, there were bugs. I guess I got bug reports. Sorry, it's just that like I usually get a response of like they just really love the story. Like nobody really talks about my mechanical stuff. Like I think some of the mechanical things I've done are pretty neat, but I think people are like so absorbed, like they're mentally thinking about the story, like so like they're so absorbed into the story that they're kind of like they're not. I don't know. Like I should just ask them what their opinion of it is as a game, but I think most people are just like really embroiled by this by the storytelling and they tell me, "Oh, I still thinking about this game like months and months later." I was like, "That is so flattering because I forget about a game as soon as I finish playing it." But so I guess my game it has is one of those things that has a lot of staying like living rent free in people's heads. But that's about all I can think of.